A cold and arrogant businessman cruelly rejects a little girl at the door of his mansion. But when he discovers that she is his own daughter, his life takes an unexpected turn that will lead him to confront secrets from the past and fight for a second chance. Can he earn her trust before losing her forever? The evening was falling in a golden blanket over the hills as Clara, barefoot and in tattered clothes, approached Rodrigo's majestic mansion. The wrought iron gate, imposing and cold, stood like a barrier between two worlds. Clara took a deep breath, gathering the courage to ring the bell. The door opened and Rodrigo's assistant Paulo appeared, his gaze kind but wary. "Can I help you, girl?" he asked softly. "Please, sir, I just need some food." "Anything," Clara replied, her eyes shining with hope. Before Paulo could respond, Rodrigo's figure loomed behind him, tall, impeccably dressed, and with an air of superiority that could be felt even from a distance. "What's going on here?" he asked coldly. Clara shuddered under his gaze. "Sir, I'm just asking for help. I don't want to bother—" Rodrigo interrupted her, his tone sharp as a knife. "Help? Is that what you're after? You think you can just show up here and ask for nothing in return? Life doesn't work like that, girl." Paulo stepped forward, uncomfortable with Rodrigo's harshness. "Sir, perhaps we could—" "No, Paulo. If we start giving away everything to anyone who knocks on our door, we'll be left with nothing." Clara felt tears begin to gather in her eyes. "I don't want money or anything fancy. I'm just hungry," she murmured. Rodrigo, impassive, crossed his arms. "There are shelters for people like you. Learn to look for real solutions instead of trying the easy way." Rodrigo's words were a blow Clara couldn't bear. Without another word, she turned on her heel and began to walk away, her muffled sobs echoing in the air. Paulo watched the scene sadly. "Sir, I think you were too harsh." Rodrigo didn't respond, his face still a mask of indifference. He turned and walked back inside the mansion, closing the door behind him. From a distance, Clara looked at the mansion one last time, a tear sliding down her cheek. She vowed to never ask someone like Rodrigo for help again, though her childish heart couldn't understand why anyone could be so cruel. Rodrigo, oblivious to the echo of his own words, sat in his office, immersing himself once again in papers and contracts, ignoring the small tremor in his conscience. Outside, night was beginning to envelop the city, while Clara disappeared into the shadows, alone once more. The next morning, Rodrigo found himself in his office, surrounded by a pile of documents. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, illuminating the space in an almost solemn manner. As he leafed through a contract, Paulo walked in with a letter in his hand, his expression more serious than usual. "Sir, this arrived this morning. It's from attorney Joaquin Andrade," he said, holding out the envelope. Rodrigo took it reluctantly, breaking the seal with a determined movement. However, as he read, his face changed. The hard lines that always marked his countenance softened, replaced by a mixture of astonishment and bewilderment. The letter mentioned a name he hadn't heard in years: Maria Helena. Rodrigo stopped short, his thoughts dragged back into the past. He remembered Maria Helena as the woman he had loved deeply, with the intensity of an ambitious youth. Yet life, or perhaps his own pride, had separated them. The lawyer explained that Maria Helena had passed away some time ago, and that she had left him something of great importance. He did not specify what it was, but he invited him to pick it up at his office as soon as possible. Rodrigo left the letter on his desk and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Memories flooded back to him, images of afternoons spent with Maria, of her contagious laughter, of the dreams they had once imagined together. But he also remembered the pain of seeing her leave, of not having done anything to stop her. Paulo noticed his change in expression and asked cautiously, "Is everything okay, sir?" Rodrigo took a few seconds to reply. "It's, an unexpected letter. Maria Helena, have I ever told you about her?" "No, sir," Paulo replied, surprised by Rodrigo's nostalgic tone, something rare in him. Rodrigo stood up and walked to the window. "She was someone important to me, but things didn't end well." Silence filled the room for a moment, broken only by the faint sound of leaves rustling in the wind. Rodrigo thought of the girl from the previous afternoon, of her desperate look and the cruel words she had thrown at him. Something inside him began to unsettle him. "Paulo," she said finally, turning to him. Tomorrow we'll go to the lawyer's office. I want to know what Maria Helena left behind, and why. As Paolo nodded, Rodrigo felt a slight pang of guilt. Was it possible that fate was playing tricks on him? That girl, what if it hadn't been a simple coincidence? Questions swirled through her mind as the past she had tried to bury for years began to emerge with force. Rodrigo and Paolo arrived punctually at the office of lawyer Joaquin Andrade. It was a sober place, with dark wood furniture and walls decorated with shelves full of legal books. Joaquin, a man with gray hair and a penetrating gaze, received them with professionalism, although with a certain gravity. Mr. Rodrigo, Joaquin began, extending his hand. Thank you for coming. There is something important that Maria Helena wanted you to know. Rodrigo nodded silently, feeling a knot begin to form in his stomach. Joaquin pulled out a brown leather folder, opened it, and handed him a sealed envelope. This letter is from her. Please read it. With trembling fingers, Rodrigo broke the seal and began to read. The words written by Maria Helena were like a dagger in his heart. Rodrigo, if you're reading this, it's because I'm no longer here. There's something I've always wanted to tell you, but I never had the courage. Clara, my daughter, is also your daughter. Rodrigo's world shook. The words repeated themselves in his mind, like an endless echo. Clara? The girl he had mercilessly rejected days before? How can you be sure of this? Rodrigo asked, barely able to get the words out. Joaquin looked at him calmly. Maria Helena left evidence. A DNA analysis was performed when Clara was still a baby. In addition, she left a detailed testimony explaining the circumstances of her birth. Rodrigo fell back into his chair, unable to process what he had just heard. Where is she now? Where is Clara? Joaquin sighed deeply. After Maria Helena passed away, Clara was left completely alone. She was abandoned by those who promised to take care of her. For years, she has lived on the streets under the occasional care of a woman named Madalena. Madalena? Rodrigo murmured, as if the name sounded vaguely familiar to him. She is a woman of strong character, Joaquin continued, who has dedicated her life to helping children like Clara. But she does not trust people of your class, Mr. Rodrigo. She believes that the elitist society that you represent has caused too much harm. Rodrigo felt guilt consuming him. His recent encounter with Clara took on a completely different meaning. He remembered her cruel words, her indifference to a girl he now knew was his daughter. Why didn't Maria Helena ever tell me? She asked quietly, looking at Joaquin. Maybe he thought you weren't ready, the lawyer replied. Or maybe time just didn't allow it. Rodrigo closed his eyes, tormented by unanswered questions. But one thing was clear. He could not leave things like this. He stood up with determination and said, I'm going to find her, whatever the cost. Joaquin handed him another letter, written by Maria Helena to Clara. Maybe this will help you get closer to her. Rodrigo took it, thanked Joaquin, and left the office with Paolo, who looked at him with a mixture of surprise and empathy. Paolo, Rodrigo said as they climbed into the car, we have work to do, and this time, I don't plan on failing. The city seemed bigger and colder than usual as Rodrigo and Paolo walked through the streets. For the first time, Rodrigo saw a side of life he had ignored for years. Barefoot children playing in the rubble, people seeking shelter under makeshift roofs, and the daily struggle to survive. Do you know where to find her? Paolo asked as he maneuvered the car through a rundown neighborhood. Rodrigo shook his head. Not exactly, but Joaquin mentioned a woman named Madalena. If we find her, she'll surely know something about Clara. Their search led them to a community shelter in the city center. The place was worn down, but it was clear that someone had put effort into making it a refuge. As they entered, a group of children eyed them suspiciously, their inquisitive gazes like shields. A woman with gray hair and steady eyes approached. Her presence was imposing, despite her short stature. What are you doing here? She asked sharply. Are you Madalena? Rodrigo asked, remaining calm. Who's asking? She replied, crossing her arms. I'm Rodrigo. I'm looking for a girl named Clara. I was told you might know something. Madalena's face hardened. And why would a man like you seek out a girl like her? Another rich man playing at being a hero? Rodrigo took a deep breath, trying to control his frustration. It's not about that. It's something personal. Madalena gave a bitter laugh. Personal, sure. You guys always have personal reasons for showing up in places like this, but never for staying. Please, Paolo intervened, his tone conciliatory. We just want to find her. Rodrigo has important reasons. Madalena's gaze softened for a brief moment, but her tone remained distrustful. Clara is under my care. I don't need someone like you coming to complicate her life. She's already suffered enough. I know I hurt her, Rodrigo admitted, looking down, and I want to make it right. I'll do whatever it takes. Madalena watched him silently, assessing him. Finally, she sighed. I don't trust you, but Clara deserves to decide for herself. If you really want to find her, look for her at the San Martin Community Shelter. She often spends her afternoons there. Rodrigo nodded, grateful. Thank you. I won't waste this opportunity. Before he could answer, Madalena added firmly. But I warn you something, sir. If you hurt her again, I will make sure that you never see her again. Understood? Rodrigo nodded again, aware of the gravity of his words. That night, as they drove home, Paolo broke the silence. Are you sure you're ready for whatever might happen? Rodrigo looked out the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. I don't know if I'm ready, Paolo, but I know I can't ignore it. Clara deserves better, and this time, I won't let her down. The San Martin Community Shelter was a modest building with worn walls and windows that let in the dim afternoon light. Upon entering, Rodrigo and Paolo found a lively atmosphere. Children playing, laughter echoing in the air, and adults handing out food with tired but sincere smiles. Paolo approached one of the shelter workers. Excuse me, we're looking for a girl named Clara. We were told she might be here. The woman, with a kind face, pointed to the back of the room. He's in the piano room. He always spends his afternoons there. Rodrigo headed for the designated spot with his heart pounding. As he approached, a delicate sound began to fill the air. The notes of a piano, played with a mixture of passion and melancholy. He stopped dead in his tracks, struck by the beauty of the music. When he reached the half-open door, he saw Clara. She was sitting in front of an old piano with worn keys. Her fingers moved gracefully, playing melodies that seemed to come from another world. Her expression was serene, as if at that moment nothing existed but her and the music. Rodrigo felt a lump in his throat. The scene transported him back in time, when Maria Helena used to play the piano with the same passion. It was impossible to deny the bond between mother and daughter. It's impressive, isn't it? Said a voice behind him. Rodrigo turned and saw Madalena, who had followed him silently. It's incredible, Rodrigo admitted, without taking his gaze off Clara. Madalena nodded. Music is the only thing that connects her to her mother. Maria Helena was also a talented musician. Clara taught herself, listening and practicing on this old piano. It's her refuge. Rodrigo swallowed, unable to contain the mixture of admiration and guilt that overwhelmed him. He took a step into the room, but when Clara saw him, her expression changed. What are you doing here? He asked, stopping abruptly. His eyes, once filled with concentration, now showed distrust and pain. Clara, I need to talk to you, Rodrigo said, in a softer tone than he usually used. I don't want to hear anything from you, she replied, rising from the bench. Are you here to humiliate me again? To tell me that I don't deserve anything? Rodrigo stepped back, overwhelmed by her reaction. No, Clara, I'm here to apologize. I didn't know who you were. If I had known... That doesn't matter, she interrupted, her eyes filled with tears. You treated me like I was worthless. Why should I listen to you now? Rodrigo was at a loss for words to respond. Madalena intervened, placing a hand on Clara's shoulder. Listen, girl, you may not want to forgive him, but you can't run away from this forever. Clara looked at him for a moment, as if assessing his intentions, and then ran out of the room, leaving Rodrigo standing in front of the piano, the echo of the notes still resonating in the air. It will take time, Madalena said, watching him closely. But if you really want to make things right, you'll have to show him that you've changed. Rodrigo nodded slowly, determined. I will do it, Madalena, whatever the cost. Rodrigo spent the next few nights lost in thought, searching for a way to make amends for his mistakes. It wasn't enough to ask for forgiveness. He needed to do something meaningful, something that would show Clara he meant business. Inspiration came as he was. I was looking through old photos of Maria Helena, in one of which she was playing the piano during a charity concert. A concert, he muttered to himself as ideas began to take shape in his mind. The next morning, she called Paolo into her office. I want to organize an event, a charity concert for street children. I need it to be big, something that really makes a difference. Paolo looked at him in surprise. It's a great idea, sir, but it won't be easy. Organizing something like this takes time and coordination. I don't care what it costs or how much effort it takes. This isn't just for Clara, but for all the children I've ignored for so long, and I want her to be the star of the concert. Paolo hesitated for a moment. What if she doesn't accept? Clara doesn't trust you. She might reject the idea altogether. Rodrigo sighed, aware of that possibility. I know, but I have to try. If I can show him that I really want to change, maybe he'll give me a chance. The team got to work right away. They contacted musicians, rented an auditorium, and designed a fundraising campaign. Rodrigo made sure everyone knew that every cent would go towards improving the living conditions of homeless children. When everything was in place, Rodrigo went to the shelter to talk to Clara. He found her in the piano room, as always, playing a melancholic melody. This time he did not approach her immediately. He stayed at a distance, listening to her until she noticed his presence. You again? Clara said with obvious displeasure. Yes, Rodrigo replied, his tone calm. But I'm not here to bother you. I want to treat you to something. Clara looked at him skeptically. What? I'm organizing a charity concert for street children. I want you to be the main star. Your talent deserves to be heard, and this event could help many people like you. Clara frowned. Why are you doing this? Is it just to clear your conscience? Rodrigo hesitated but decided to be honest. Yes, partly, but I'm also doing this because I want you to see that I'm willing to change. I want to do something that makes a difference, and I know you can be a part of that. Clara stared at him, trying to figure out if he meant it. Finally, she stood up from the piano and said, I'll think about it, but I'm not making any promises. Rodrigo nodded, grateful that he hadn't received a definitive no. Take all the time you need. I just want you to know that this time I'm here to stay. As Clara left the room, Maddalena appeared at the door. You're giving her a chance, Rodrigo. Don't waste it. Rodrigo nodded, his gaze fixed on the door through which Clara had left. I won't, Maddalena. This time, I won't. The day of the concert was approaching, and although everything was going according to plan, Clara's participation was still uncertain. Rodrigo was becoming more and more anxious, wondering if he would be able to convince her. He knew that words would not be enough. Clara needed action, something tangible to prove her sincerity. One afternoon, while he was working on the final details of the event, Paolo came into his office with an idea. Sir, what if we showed Clara something that reminds her of her mother? It might help her understand why this is so important to you. Rodrigo thought about the suggestion. It's a good idea, but I have nothing from Maria Helena that I can share with her. It's all in the past. Paolo smiled slightly. Not everything. Joaquin gave me something else when we were in his office. Photos and mementos of Maria Helena that Clara has never seen. Rodrigo was silent for a moment, thinking about how to best use those items. Gather everything and call Maddalena. I want her and Clara to come here. It's time for both of them to know the whole truth. That same night, Maddalena and Clara arrived at the mansion, although with obvious discomfort. Clara kept her eyes down, while Maddalena observed everything cautiously, as if looking for signs that something was going to go wrong. Rodrigo received them in his study. On the table was a wooden box, simple but well cared for. Thank you for coming, he said in a kind, almost humble tone. I know you don't trust me, Clara, and I don't blame you for that, but I want to show you something. She opened the box and began to take out its contents, photographs of Maria Helena playing the piano, letters she had written, and even an old sheet of music with handwritten notes. Clara approached slowly, her eyes filling with tears as she looked at the memories of her mother. Your mother was an amazing woman, Rodrigo said, his voice thick with emotion. I loved her more than I can say, but I was a coward. I wasn't there for her when she needed me most, and because of that, I failed you too. Clara took one of the photos, a picture of Maria Helena smiling as she played the piano. She always talked about music, she said quietly. It was her life. Rodrigo nodded. And it's yours too. That's why I want you to play at the concert. Not just for the other children, but as a tribute to her. I want the world to see the talent you inherited from your mother. Madalena, who had been watching silently, intervened. I can't force you to trust him, Clara, but I think this is an opportunity you shouldn't pass up. Clara remained silent for several minutes, looking at the photos and memories. Finally, she looked up at Rodrigo. If I do this, it won't be for you. It will be for my mother and for me. Rodrigo nodded, accepting her condition. That's all I can ask for. That night, as Clara and Madalena left, Rodrigo felt a small bridge begin to form between him and his daughter. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The auditorium was packed. The lights illuminated the stage, and the murmur of the audience filled the air with a mixture of anticipation and excitement. It was an important night, not just for Rodrigo, but for all the street children whose lives could be changed by what was achieved at this event. Behind the scenes, however, Clara still had doubts. In a small room behind the stage, Clara looked at the simple yet elegant dress Madalena had chosen for her. Her hands trembled as she tried to calm the whirlwind of emotions she felt. I can't do it, Madalena, she said, turning away from the mirror. This is too much. What if I fail? What if he's just using this to look good to everyone? Madalena walked over, putting a hand on his shoulder. Clara, I know you're scared, and you have every right to feel that way. But this moment isn't just for Rodrigo. It's for you, for your mother, and for all those children who need hope. You can do this. At that moment, Paolo entered, holding an envelope. Clara, before you make a decision, I want you to read this. It's a letter your mother wrote for you before she died. Rodrigo wanted you to have it. Clara took the envelope with trembling hands. She opened it and began to read. My dear Clara, if you are reading this, it is because I can no longer be with you. I want you to know that you have always been my greatest joy and strength. Never let anyone make you feel less than you are. You have a talent that comes from the heart, and I want you to share it with the world. No matter what happens, I will always be proud of you. With eternal love, Mom. Tears streamed down Clara's face as she read her mother's words. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. Finally, she looked at Madalena and Paolo. I will. For her. Minutes later, the lights in the auditorium dimmed, and the presenter took the stage to announce Clara. Here is a young woman whose talent and strength are an example to us all. Please give Clara a big round of applause. Rodrigo watched from the audience, his heart pounding as Clara walked to the piano. Her small figure looked fragile under the lights, but there was a determination in her gaze that filled him with pride. Clara sat down at the piano, closed her eyes for a moment, and let her mother's words guide her. Then she began to play. The room fell completely silent. The notes flowed like a river, filling the space with a mixture of sadness and hope. Clara's music spoke of her life, of her struggle, and of the dreams she still had. Each note was a conversation with her mother, a tribute to everything she had lost and gained. When she finished, the auditorium erupted in applause. Clara stood up, tears in her eyes, and looked at the audience. Then unexpectedly, she took the microphone. I want to thank everyone for being here tonight, she said, her voice shaky but steady. This music was for my mother, who taught me to love and fight, even though she's not here anymore. It was also for all the children who, like me, have had to face the world alone. I hope this is just the beginning of something better for all of us. The audience rose to their feet, applauding loudly. Rodrigo, among them, felt something inside him break. Tears ran down his face as he applauded his daughter. That night, Clara and Rodrigo took the first step towards a relationship full of challenges, but also hope. The concert had been a resounding success. The funds raised exceeded all expectations, and Clara's words remained etched in the memories of those who attended. However, for Rodrigo, the event was not an end, but the true beginning of his transformation. The next morning, Rodrigo visited the San Martin shelter. This time, he didn't arrive in a fancy suit or with rehearsed words, but with a clear purpose: to listen and understand. He walked among the children, sat with them, and asked them about their dreams, their fears, and how he could really help them. Mr. Rodrigo, said a shelter worker, looking at him curiously, I never thought I'd see someone like you here, sitting on the floor playing with the children. Rodrigo smiled slightly. I didn't imagine it either, but I think it was time for a change. Meanwhile, Clara watched from a distance. Although her heart was filled with mixed emotions, she couldn't deny that Rodrigo seemed sincere in his effort. However, she still maintained a barrier, afraid that it was all temporary. Madalena, ever attentive, approached Clara. "You can't keep that barrier up forever, child. Rodrigo may have made mistakes, but he's trying to correct them now. That's more than most do." Clara looked at Madalena seriously. "It's not easy, Madalena. I find it hard to trust him after everything that happened." "I'm not telling you to trust him right away," Madalena replied, "but I do tell you to watch his actions. Time will tell if his intentions are real." Days later, Rodrigo organized a meeting with several community organizations to discuss how they could use the funds from the concert. Instead of deciding everything on his own, he let the voices of those working with the children lead the way. "This is not just my project," he said at the meeting. "It is something we must build together." Paulo, who had been by his side from the beginning, couldn't help but feel proud. "I never thought I'd see it like this, sir," he commented privately. Rodrigo smiled. "It's never too late to learn, Paulo." As the weeks passed, Clara began to notice the consistency in Rodrigo's efforts. He didn't just limit himself to grand gestures. He also showed up at the shelter to help with simple tasks, like serving food or fixing up the facilities. He was a different man than the one she had met that afternoon at the mansion. One day while Rodrigo was working at the shelter, Clara came over. "I wanted to tell you that the concert was good," she said shyly. Rodrigo looked at her, surprised but grateful. "Thank you, Clara. It means a lot to me that you're here." She hesitated for a moment before adding, "I still don't fully trust you, but I'm starting to believe that you really do want to change." Rodrigo nodded, accepting her words with humility. "I understand, Clara, and I don't expect you to trust me right away. I just want to show you that I'm here to stay." That little exchange marked a step forward in their relationship. It wasn't a solid bond yet, but the foundations were beginning to form. Rodrigo understood that he couldn't erase the past, but he could build a better future, not only for Clara, but for all the children he once ignored. The sun softly illuminated the San Martin shelter, where Clara and Rodrigo sat on a bench in silence. Weeks had passed since the concert, and although the relationship between them was still fragile, it had begun to consolidate. "I want to find my biological father," Clara said suddenly, breaking the silence. Her words were direct, but her voice was a mixture of determination and fear. Rodrigo looked at her, surprised. Although he hadn't expected that comment, he was quick to respond. "I'll help you, Clara. No matter where he is or who he is, I'll do everything I can to help you find him." Clara watched him closely, searching for signs of insincerity, but found none. For the first time, she felt she could rely on his support. The following days were dedicated to research. Rodrigo used his contacts and resources to search for clues about the whereabouts of Clara's biological father. At the same time, he continued to work on new projects to support street children, making sure that the funds raised at the concert were used effectively. The next morning, Rodrigo visited the San Martin shelter. This time, he didn't arrive in a fancy suit or with rehearsed words, but with a clear purpose: to listen and understand. He walked among the children, sat with them, and asked them about their dreams, their fears, and how he could really help them. "Mr. Rodrigo," said a shelter worker, looking at him curiously, "I never thought I'd see someone like you here, sitting on the floor playing with the children." Rodrigo smiled slightly. "I didn't imagine it either, but I think it was time for a change." Meanwhile, Clara watched from a distance. Although her heart was filled with mixed emotions, she couldn't deny that Rodrigo seemed sincere in his effort. However, she still maintained a barrier, afraid that it was all temporary. Madalena, ever attentive, approached Clara. "You can't keep that barrier up forever, child. Rodrigo may have made mistakes, but he's trying to correct them now. That's more than most do." Clara looked at Madalena seriously. "It's not easy, Madalena. I find it hard to trust him after everything that happened." "I'm not telling you to trust him right away," Madalena replied, "but I do tell you to watch his actions. Time will tell if his intentions are real." Days later, Rodrigo organized a meeting with several community organizations to discuss how they could use the funds from the concert. Instead of deciding everything on his own, He let the voices of those working with the children lead the way. "This is not just my project," he said at the meeting. "It is something we must build together." Paolo, who had been by his side from the beginning, couldn't help but feel proud. "I never thought I'd see it like this, sir," he commented privately. Rodrigo smiled. "It's never too late to learn, Paolo." As the weeks passed, Clara began to notice the consistency in Rodrigo's efforts. He didn't just limit himself to grand gestures. He also showed up at the shelter to help with simple tasks, like serving food or fixing up the facilities. He was a different man than the one she had met that afternoon at the mansion. One day while Rodrigo was working at the shelter, Clara came over. "I wanted to tell you that the concert was good," she said shyly. Rodrigo looked at her, surprised but grateful. "Thank you, Clara. It means a lot to me that you're here." She hesitated for a moment before adding, "I still don't fully trust you, but I'm starting to believe that you really do want to change." Rodrigo nodded, accepting her words with humility. "I understand, Clara, and I don't expect you to trust me right away. I just want to show you that I'm here to stay." That little exchange marked a step forward in their relationship. It wasn't a solid bond yet, but the foundations were beginning to form. Rodrigo understood that he couldn't erase the past, but he could build a better future, not only for Clara, but for all the children he once ignored. The sun softly illuminated the San Martin shelter, where Clara and Rodrigo sat on a bench in silence. Weeks had passed since the concert, and although the relationship between them was still fragile, it had begun to consolidate. "I want to find my biological father," Clara said suddenly, breaking the silence. Her words were direct, but her voice was a mixture of determination and fear. Rodrigo looked at her, surprised. Although he hadn't expected that comment, he was quick to respond. "I'll help you, Clara. No matter where he is or who he is, I'll do everything I can to help you find him." Clara watched him closely, searching for signs of insincerity, but found none. For the first time, she felt she could rely on his support. The following days were dedicated to research. Rodrigo used his contacts and resources to search for clues about the whereabouts of Clara's biological father. At the same time, he continued to work on new projects to support street children, making sure that the funds raised at the concert were used effectively. Meanwhile, Clara began spending more time with Rodrigo, accompanying him on his visits to the shelters and participating in community activities. Little by little, she began to see a side of him she never imagined, a man genuinely committed to doing good. "You're changing," Madalena commented one day as she watched Rodrigo interact with the children. "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad to see what you're doing." Rodrigo smiled modestly. "I can't change the past, Madalena, but I can make sure I don't repeat my mistakes." Finally, after weeks of searching, they received news. Paolo arrived at the mansion with a folder in his hands. "We have information about Clara's biological father," he announced, placing the document on the table. Rodrigo looked at Clara, waiting for her reaction. "Are you ready for this?" he asked her. Clara nodded firmly, though her nervousness was evident. "Yes, I need to know who it is, though I don't know what I'll find." The file revealed that Clara's father lived in a small town several hours away. Without hesitation, Rodrigo arranged the trip, insisting that he would be with her every step of the way. The journey was calm, filled with moments of reflection. When they arrived, Clara felt a knot in her stomach, but also a strange sense of peace. Standing in front of the door of a modest house, she took a deep breath before knocking. The door slowly opened, and an older man with tired but warm eyes appeared in the doorway. His gaze met Clara's, and time seemed to stand still. "Clara?" the man asked, his voice cracking with emotion. She nodded, unable to hold back her tears. "It's me." The reunion was emotional, filled with tears and hugs. Although the road to understanding each other and rebuilding their relationship would be long, Clara knew she had taken an important step towards her own healing. On her way back, Clara looked at Rodrigo with a grateful expression. "Thank you for this, for everything." Rodrigo smiled, feeling for the first time in a long time that he was in the right place. "I'll always be here for you, Clara, no matter what comes." The next few days were filled with hope and new beginnings. Clara began to explore her own goals, thinking about how she could use her musical talent to help others. Rodrigo, for his part, continued with his community projects, determined to be a pillar in Clara's life and that of many others. The past was no longer an impossible burden to overcome. For Clara and Rodrigo, the future presented itself as a blank canvas full of possibilities.